Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us and thank you for your patience. The pledging conference for UNRWA lasted a bit longer, and that was because we had many delegations intervening and expressing strong messages of support and commitment to UNRWA. It was actually a very impressive round, and it was opened by statements by two UNRWA students, Hanan, who is a student from the West Bank, a member of UNRWA's student parliament in the West Bank, and we also had Hatem, who is a student in the student parliaments in Gaza. Their messages were very strong to the entire member states of the General Assembly, which was to say, UNRWA's education is a lifeline, it's the oxygen, it's the hope that keeps us alive and with some form of horizon. Member states reacted, I think, very positively to that. We had numerous interventions from the floor from all regions of the planet. And the strong statements of support were not only about the trust placed in UNRWA and how we manage our operations and how we run the organization, but in particular also for the human dignity that we provide and regional stability that we contribute to. When we look at the statements of support and when we look at the announcements that were made in the room today and in the immediate run-up to this particular pledging conference, we have announcements of just over $110 million, which is very important in regard to our overall funding requirements of this year of $1.2 billion. That's the overall amount. So we know that with all of the efforts that are underway by the organization to mobilize the funding, over $110 million is an important amount. We also have, of course, now a work and need to go back to the different delegations. That's why I can't give you now a list of individual countries, because we have to go back after the announcements to each and every one of the countries just to verify the amounts, to verify obviously how much of this is also new money and how much of it had been initially already pledged at the beginning of the year. But the money is important. We have called for early disbursements of these funds. That would of course be a very important step in avoiding a summer crisis that we have been referring to, in particular in relation to UNRWA's food assistance in Gaza, for example, but also, of course, the prospects of opening the school year on time for 500,000 boys and girls at the end of August, beginning of September. Very encouraging is also the fact that several countries in the room indicated their commitment to further contributions to UNRWA. So as always in a pledging conference, you have some countries that actually announce on the day and others have to continue to work on it somewhat, but we have clear indications from several other countries that they will come forward in coming days and weeks with additional funds. So we are encouraged by this meeting, very grateful to the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General for having participated in this meeting personally, and the fact that so many member states reaffirmed their deep trust and commitment in UNRWA and in Palestine refugees, in particular in our students, was a matter of great encouragement. So I think here we have a solid day behind us, and we'll continue to work on that basis. Thank you, and your comments.
Mr. Krähenbühl, can you tell us, since today also happens to be the first day of economic workshop in Manama, can you tell us how you see the difference between that effort to help Palestinians and UNRWA's effort to help Palestinians?
Well, UNRWA's effort to help Palestine refugees originates from a mandate given by the General Assembly. And so, of course, our focus is on a day-to-day basis. We deal with the realities of today. And the realities of today is to keep 500,000 students in our schools, to keep over 8.5 million patient visits running in our health centers, and of course to keep 1.5 million people supported in emergency funds. That's happening today, tomorrow and the day after. Not in 3 years, not in 5 years. And so we're focused on delivering that mandate. And of course in our experience then you have other events taking place in parallel. And if any of these events would lead to improvements in terms of peace or economic conditions, that is welcome. There is no competition between these events. We're just focused on the mandate that we received and that we have to deliver on.
Are you concerned that some pledges that will be made, if they will be made in Manama, will come on the expense of pledges to UNRWA?
Every indication we have in our meeting today is that there will be nothing at the expense of.
How do you evaluate the contribution of Saudi Arabia to the...
Sorry, I didn't understand.
How do you evaluate the contribution and the support of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to UNRWA?
So last year, in 2018, Saudi Arabia was the third largest donor to UNRWA with a very significant amount of funding. And we are working very closely with the Kingdom this year. I was recently in Riyadh for a meeting with His Excellency the Foreign Minister Al-Asaf. And so we are very much looking forward also to ongoing confirmations from the Kingdom, because our message to all donors was the hope to maintain last year's levels of contribution. So we're, of course, also working actively with the Kingdom on that.
Mr. Krähenbühl, can I just ask, it's a bit confusing when you sought $1.2 billion to fund for 2019, and this is the 2019 pledging event. You say you had active pledges today of $110 million. How can you address, that as a success? I mean, I understand many countries spoke and they expressed support, but they didn't give a number. What are you doing now to make sure that you've got enough money to continue UNRWA services for the next 12 months? Because that figure does not come across.
Well, it's not for the next 12 months, for this year, right? So it's for this year. So, of course, since we're already at the end of June, that means we have obviously already mobilized a very significant part of the amount that was needed for the beginning of the year. So we covered all of our costs from the 1st of January to the 31st of May from many of the donors that pledged early in the year, and some of them were, of course, in the room as well today. And then they contributed, some of them made early disbursements, they came forward. So we covered the first 5 months of the year very positively. It is now in June that we enter deficit figures, and this is why this pledging conference was very important, to overcome and to avoid that these initial deficit figures would translate into disruption of services. So as it always works throughout the year, you don't have a single event that will cover everything in one go. I mean, maybe sometimes I wish that would be the case, but that's not the way fundraising works in the humanitarian. So you use a pledging conference like today to consolidate what we achieved in the first 5 months. We hope this allows us to bridge a lot of the needs that we have over the next 3 to 4 months. You can expect us to be back on the margins of the General Assembly in September to seek further mobilizations, and of course from tonight onwards I will continue traveling to get the rest of the money. So if you compare it to last year, this same pledging conference had mobilized just around 39 to 40 million US dollars. So I think there the amount is actually significant and encouraging.
So basically what you were saying there, just to follow up briefly to cover that, January to May was filled. June you started going into deficit. The 110 million figure you mentioned right now, that is immediate or soon to be immediately accessible funds, and moving on from then you will look at further funding. For example, several countries said they have envelopes stretching over a 4-year period. For example, Sweden mentioned 200 million. Are those the kind of donors who you will have extremely extensive discussions with to make sure that funding continues?
So your summary is correct. So we had covered the first 5 months. We are now entering into deficit. So the 110, if rapidly dispersed, because that's of course my other humble plea to the donors, is that those who announced today, we would really call on them to then rapidly disperse so that it actually impacts the management of the cash shortfalls that we face now in the summer period. And then we will continue in parallel to reach out. So I can give you an example. In today's meeting and in the days to come, we will, for example, also actively focus on the relationships with our Gulf partners, because as always, you have an event like this. In some cases, countries will make announcements, and others they will prefer to make their announcements separately and individually, which we will certainly work on in the case of Gulf countries, for example. I will come right back.
Do you have any estimate for Gulf countries who were from today's pledging, since they're also being asked in Bahrain to pledge? Are they doing it in both places? Did you get more than you expected?
So from today, specifically from the Gulf countries, we had no additional announcements. That is the example I was giving. We have from Gulf countries clear indications, very strong messages of political support, very strong engagement from all of the Gulf countries that spoke today in the room. and an indication that they are actively considering further support to UNRWA. That's what I mentioned. Sometimes member states will decide to pledge at a given event. Sometimes they will make announcements on their own terms, and this is absolutely standard practice. But I am very confident and very encouraged by the signals and the strong signals we receive from Gulf countries, and I'm sure that we'll have announcements quite shortly from some of them.
I'm still confused about the money, actually.
Sorry.
Am I right in thinking that you came in today wanting 211 million, and you've gotten 110 million? Does that mean that you're 101 million down?
Well, no. When you take the overall efforts, we have 1.2 billion is what we need throughout the year.
Yeah.
Right? And so, as I said, we covered the first 5 months, which is very positive,
Right.
and now we've entered deficit figures. So when you enter deficit figures, you try and use every leveraging point that you have, either through visits to the countries themselves or a pledging conference like this. We'll have to analyze what the question that you're asking is. There's an overall estimated end-of-year shortfall of 211 million, right? Which compares to the 446 million of last year, which we overcame successfully. The 211 million, we now have to verify how much of the money that was pledged today will actually help us to overcome the actual shortfall. But don't complicate things too much. What was announced today is just in excess of 110 million. We now, as I said, have to go back to individual countries to confirm that. We will then produce a consolidated list, but I can compare it to the roughly 40 million that we came out of this same pledging conference last year. In that sense, it's a very significant step, and we will build on that.
110 is good, but you still need more money.
It's a very good amount. We clearly need more money, and we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, got it.
Mr. Krähenbühl,
Yep.
Michelle Nichols from Reuters. Remind us how long you've been in this job for now?
It's just over 5 years.
5 years. So maybe instead of, given we're struggling a little with the numbers, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how this compares to previous years. Are you optimistic? Is it more of a struggle this year? Is it getting easier? Something along those lines. And also the mandate renewal is coming up later this year. Are you concerned that the United States might try to change things or get rid of it altogether?
All right, so, every year is a very big struggle in financial terms for a humanitarian organization, and it's clearly the case for UNRWA. But there was a period, if you take my experience in 2014, 15, 16, and maybe 17, that was maybe a bit more of a traditional challenge, drawing attention to an issue that has been in existence for decades, while, of course, many donors will focus on some of the newer crises, which is one of the trends, the challenge to mobilize sufficient funding. So that was, I think, the traditional experience. Of course, from last year, we faced the unprecedented reality of having our single largest donor, the United States, cut $300 million and cut another $60 million this year. Now, if you spend $1.2 billion a year and you have your largest donor removing $300 million in a given year, you face what is an existential crisis. And there we mobilized the international community under a campaign that we call Dignity is Priceless, and managed to overcome through savings internally, but especially additional money that was mobilized, to overcome that unprecedented shortfall. So both, of course, last year was certainly the most difficult financial year ever in the history of UNRWA, but it was also an extraordinarily rewarding year because 42 countries and institutions added funding to UNRWA in that particular year. And every pledge that was made to us last year was honored before the end of the year. So we actually have probably the best support base in overall political terms that we've ever had in the history of this institution. Now, every year is a challenge, and this year it's not a surprise to me that we have to struggle again, that we have to reach out, knock on every door, and try and reconfirm the exact levels of contributions that we received. And the very fact that we managed to cover the first 5 months of the year without any interruption of service is a very strong and positive signal. Now, we said to the donor community there is a real risk of interruption of some of the services during the summer if we don't manage to mobilize additional money. So again, don't be destabilized by the numbers. It's 110 million announcements now, and we will then spell out in the coming days in our press communications exactly which countries, to confirm the numbers, because of course we have to go back to them now to assert that. And it's an important step in our efforts to overcome this year's shortfall. Now, we need more money than that, but it is a very important step.
Just a quick follow-up.
Sorry, on the mandate you wanted to.
Yeah, but just a quick follow-up on that. I guess then you was talking about the great momentum last year to overcome that huge gap. Are you still seeing the same momentum?
Yes, I'm seeing the same momentum, because I have never seen in the history of UNRWA so many delegations refer in a detailed way to the trust and the indispensable nature, that was said many times today in the room, of UNRWA, the recognition for the strength of our management and the way in which we run the organization. So there were a lot of things that were said there that are reflecting the momentum of last year. Now, I know every single member state will sometimes have to struggle to meet the same level of funding, and that's quite normal. Last year were extraordinary efforts by many donors, so we will have to keep coming back, but we are encouraged by what happened today. There's no doubt. And on the mandate, just briefly, this will happen towards the end of the year. The negotiations on the resolution will start. I think I heard again in the room today several expressions of support for a mandate renewal that would be smooth and not controversial in that sense. That is certainly what we're looking forward to. And I think when you see the students that we're speaking today in this room, it is definitely worth every step of the way preserving this mandate and UNRWA's role.
Commissioner, I think you mentioned that you have some deadlines by the end of this month for some of your services. So how urgent it is to receive money today, or within how many days you need urgent money to be paid to UNRWA, and what are the main services that may be under the risk of maybe stop or not functioning well if you don't receive money urgently?
So it is urgent to receive the money, because we are in a cash flow crisis now, and that's the shortfall is actually not that necessarily donors don't have the intention of adding money at a later stage, but right now we don't have enough money in our accounts to run all of our services. So we're having to take measures already now to delay some of the payments, to seek especially advanced by many of the governments to pay earlier, and we did have several delegations in the room saying they will try to disperse as early as possible. This is very important. The one that's most at risk that we have been speaking about is UNRWA provides 1 million people in the Gaza Strip with food assistance. That happens, these are distributions that take place 4 times a year, and you need in total annually $80 million for that, and we don't have enough money for guaranteeing these smooth distributions throughout the year. So this is one of the key objectives of this pledging conference, was to mobilize the needed money to keep the food pipeline uninterrupted, because you can imagine with all of the pressures and challenges that people face in the Gaza Strip, 1 million people receiving food assistance in Gaza is actually half of the population that receive food assistance. We cannot afford, nobody can afford, not for human dignity and not for regional stability, an interruption in that. And that was one of the messages we had today. So yes, early disbursement is very important.
One final question.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Jordan Dagams from the student newspaper, also Jordanian. First of all, congratulations on your very successful conference, which I attended with you today. I have a question, which is like ABC. I'm not sure if you already spoke to my colleague about it. When you talk about year, do you mean, like, do you have financial years, like you end from July to June next year, or you have, like, from January to end of December? This is one. And today, which country was the largest contributor in today's conference, the number one? Also, I heard almost from the 50 speaker that UNRWA is indispensable. It's very urgent to remain working until the final status of Palestinian-Israeli solution. What can you say to those who think they should abolish UNRWA? Thank you.
So the year, our sort of financial year is from the 1st of January to 31st of December. So our budget is now for 2019. That's the 1.2 billion we are looking for, is to cover the expenses of the whole year, which means, of course, as I said earlier, we have received some of it, and the amounts that were pledged today are additional amounts. So this is how we build out. So the fiscal year is from 1st of January to 31st of December. On the question of, people who think that one can today dispense with UNRWA, let me just say it very, very clearly. There is no other actor in the Middle East today in a position or able to take over the education for 500,000 boys and girls that we have in our schools. And just if you think of it for 1 second, what would happen if 280,000 boys and girls that are in our schools in the Gaza Strip would not have access to UNRWA education? Where would they go? To which schools would they go? We, at the same time, have had throughout last year the entire leadership in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, for example, His Majesty the King, His Excellency the Foreign Minister, saying time and time again that if the 122,000 boys and girls that are in UNRWA schools in the kingdom no longer had access to education, it would become a matter of national stability and security. So it's very, very clear and crucial to keep those services going, to realize not only the indispensable role of today, but the extraordinary contribution that UNRWA has made to human development, to the attainment and fulfillment of SDGs in education and healthcare throughout the region. And again, nobody can say it better than our students today. The oxygen, the prospects, the horizon that is preserved by the access to the schools in UNRWA is something that is irreplaceable. And we're very proud of that. And until and so long that the General Assembly maintains its focus and its commitment to that mandate, we are absolutely determined to fulfill it. Thank you.
Which was the most mentioned today?
There were big contributions and big announcements made by the European Union, the UK and others, but we will give a detailed list once we've put it together. Thank you very much.